It's 250 years since Abbeyleix became a town in 1775. So what better way to mark that anniversary than to have the 7th Viscount DeVesci, or Thomas DeVesci, here with us to go through plenty of photographs and plenty of oral history and history that was carried down through the years. The building we're in at the moment, his great-great-great-grandfather, the 2nd Viscount DeVesci, built it in 1836. So all through the town, be it in job creation, in buildings, in education, in social aspects, all aspects of life, the DeVesci family have been central to Abbeyleix since the 1770s or thereabouts. So I'm just going to hand you over now to Lord DeVesci, Tom, in a second. I just want to thank staff, most of who are not present here at the moment, but Jackie is here, for having helped so much in helping to organise this talk and to get you going, and to thank Tom himself. Now I'm just going to hand you over to Tom, and we'll give him a warm welcome, and just to thank him very much for taking the time to do this presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Walter and his colleagues just to make that heroic IT challenges to get this right. But we should sort of overcome them, I think. We have, instead of a mouse, we have the Beach Nationalist. Mouse pad. Hopefully it will work. And I apologise in advance for anyone who thought they were going to come and get an interesting talk, because you should ask for money back now. Because my idea this evening was more, because it's Heritage Week, to try to urge people to pass on stories of what they've heard from earlier generations. My grandparents were born in the 1880s, and like so many people, I wish that I had asked them so many questions. And by the time very often one gets an interest in one's local history and local time, the people who had that information are no longer there. And ironically, now we're in an age where we have IT and the ability to communicate more than ever. In some ways, we communicate less than ever, we talk less. We have access to more information online, but we probably pass on less information in the home, because people talk less than they used to 100 years ago, when there were fewer options of an evening. So really my mission or hope this evening is that I can perhaps provoke people to pass on everything they know to the younger generation, or write it down. If there are some very elderly people around who perhaps not do it, to try and get as much information as you can before they're lost, and very often the information is lost. There's so many things that I wish I'd asked my parents and grandparents, and the opportunity is gone. So really, what I was planning to do, if you forgive me, is to gallop through an improvised scrapbook of pictures of things and people that were current in Abbeyleix within the memory of my grandparents, which is possibly the people here today who might have spoken to their grandparents and haven't yet written down what they learned as children, or haven't yet passed it on to the next generation, or if the next generation just weren't listening, again, haven't written it down. It's so important that you don't lose this information. It does seem to me that the older generation have such a depth and richness of information that it's a tragedy that we're going to lose so much of it. So if you forgive me, it's more of a gallop through of what I know are far too many images for proper talk. And I have to guess with the internationalist. So starting with people who were in the library, my grandparents' generation. This was both Viscount. He was known as Ivor, he was actually called Robert William. And he died in 1903. So my grandparents would have been in the 20s when he died. And he was a very interesting figure. He looks very stuffy and old-fashioned. He was very intelligent. and he was in the military. But his friends pretended to be artists and aesthetes and writers as well as politicians. And his circle of friends that you will see in his visitors book were an extraordinary eclectic mix of people. He wasn't the hunting, shooting, fishing type. He was much more into interesting and intelligent conversations about politics and art and so forth. That was the household when he was in his heyday. You can see the amount of stuff. There are some guests there. But that basically was the household staff in Abbeyleix at the turn of the 20th century. So a big institution, if you like, footmen, butlers, coachmen, etc. And it's such a shame that there don't seem to be any memories of passed down of people who worked in the house. And we've got such an interesting picture. That was his wife, Evelyn, who, somewhat confusingly, she had the monogram E, which we see on some of the buildings around the town. I think the E on the buildings refers more to the previous generation, which was Emma. But Evelyn had a lot of influence in the town because she was so interested in the aesthetics and the arts and crafts. And I'll come back to that later. She had this very romantic, wistful face, and she seemed to always just wear a single pearl earring. And she was renowned as being a great beauty. So you can see there a portrait of her. And I put a description of her that came from a book called Memoirs of an Irish Countess by Lady Fingal, which just happened to buy at Dublin Airport once. And it struck me how I was very touched by the description of Evelyn DeVesci. And if you allow me, I'll just read it out. She says, I think it was in St. Patrick's Hall too that I first saw Evelyn DeVesci, a Scotswoman. Her brother, Lord Elker, was to marry George Wyndham's sister that year. She had fallen in love with Ireland when she married Lord DeVesci and came to live at Abbeyleix. She's not easy to describe. She was and is simply unlike anyone else. She had something much more rare than beauty. I think now she was like a Rossetti picture, with her deep-set eyes and her priestess look. Her way of dressing was absolutely her own. She wore very simple things, beautifully draped, which accentuated her height and slenderness. I thought that she dressed like an angel. She hardly ever wore any jewels. I have later memories of her. One at Abbeyleix, when it was late May, and the woods were a sheet of bluebells under a roof of palest green, and Evelyn walked in them, her feet deep in that heavenly carpet. The bluebells at Abbeyleix were famous, and Mary, her daughter, who was more like a young Joan of Arc than any child I had ever seen, ran ahead, leaving a little trail where flowers were bent, such as a small boat makes on a summer sea. I think we talked of Ireland. We were always talking of Ireland in those days. Even the Wyndhams, who were descended from their own Fitzgerald, did not love Ireland more, or perhaps as much as Evelyn loved it. I remember her care to stop and talk to all the country people we met, and her anxiety lest she should admit the least degree of thought and courtesy in any one of them. How they adored her at Abbeyleix. I saw Mary Weasy later at a castle ball in Dublin, where she'd grown up and was just out, and with her eagle face like a splendid boy's, she looked more than ever like a St. Job, but I wanted to give her a horse and standard. This was my first vision of Evelyn DeVesci. In later years, I stayed several times with her at Abbeyleix, and we were both fellow guests on occasion at Parton with the Leinsters. We met her at other country houses too in those years, when we were all busy with Ireland. She became a great friend of Horace Plunkett's, who used to visit Kildare, his house in Foxrock. So that gives a picture of Evelyn DeVesci, and the romantic figure she was. And she absolutely adored Abbeyleix and continued in her will to come back and visit. That's a close-up of the same picture. You can see that wistful, romantic thing. looked at them again, just wearing those single pearl earrings. And during her time, this is what Abbeyleix sort of looked like. I think many of you will have seen either this picture or a similar picture. The market house that we're in now is slightly different with the cupola at the top. But many of us here today will remember fair days in cars and not horses, but not that unlike that. And Pembroke Terrace again, some of you will have seen this picture. This is what Abbeyleix sort of looked like during Evelyn's time. And not Pig Fair Day again, which many of us will remember. I think it was once a month if I remember rightly. And again, it's so important that the younger generation get this information before we're all gone. And then as Evelyn, again you can see her typically dressed in this romantic look she had. Here she's next to the grave of her brother-in-law, Eustace. And that tombstone is actually now inside the old church. It was a brass cover which was not really suited for being outside. And had always puzzled it why it was in the old church on a wall. I was delighted to find this picture which shows that it wasn't designed to be outside, but not really thought through Irish weather. Even and her husband John was brother, only had one child, and they had Mary, their daughter, quite late. So Mary got her only child and suffered an unfairness that she didn't inherit, and she married. Well, we heard that went to live in England, but she adored Abbeyleix, and she was my godmother. She used to regularly come back and visit. She got on very well with my father, and she loved coming to Abbeyleix. She was very eccentric and unique figure, like her mother was. That's her father's grave. And he was only 59 when he died. If you look at his grave, his pictures, he looked much older, because he had this sort of wolf-like moustache. But he was an extraordinary figure, and he was the person that Gladstone came and discussed Irish politics with. And Gladstone used him as a sort of sounding board for what might be politically possible amongst the landowning gentry of Ireland who tended to push back against Gladstone's political aspirations. And interesting enough, I found a signed picture from Daniel O'Connell in amongst his things. So there was obviously good relationships with the various different elements of the political divide. Anyway, now, what I mentioned at the start, when that fourth wife died, instead of erecting another fountain, probably not going to reach by that time, Evelyn and his widow decided that what he would have liked most was to refurbish this building. So you'll be familiar with that inscription above the door as you came in, which shows that the refurbishment of this building was a memorial to him. And that's recorded in this tablet, which you can read on the way out. And that was erected 3 years after the fire in 1906. And there is Evelyn. She would come back. Often when her nephew would inherit, whether he was here or not, she would come and move into the house for a couple of months in summer. And absolutely adored being here. Her final years were spent in England, but she really did for Abbeyleix. And that's her in the drawing room at Abbeyleix house, looking out. And her husband's, one of her husband's sisters never married. She was called Georgina. She's the figure on the left there. And she was said by many people to have Fenian sympathies, which was considered very odd for somebody with her background. And apparently she used to spend summer afternoons sitting outside Bluegate Cottage opposite Kilmarnock, where she would chat to people, and people would come to her and if there was a problem or something they wanted sorted or a favour they wanted for Lord DeVesci, they'd go and see what was always referred to as Aunt Georgie in our family. And I don't know why she got married, but she never did. And they actually, in the end, they lived together. So the two sisters-in-law, one never married and one widow. And they spent most of the time together. They come back to Abbeyleix together in the summer. And there is Evelyn and her sister, and Mary in the middle, Evelyn's daughter, by that time growing up, and one of Mary's daughters on the right. Again, at Abbeyleix, showing how often he used to come back there. And there is Evelyn again, curiously enough with Lord Kenmare, whose daughter went on to marry my grandfather Tom, who was Evelyn's nephew. This is Mary, their only daughter, Kate Murphy on the left, who lived in a laundry cottage in Abbeyleix. I know almost nothing about Kate Murphy. I would love to know more about her. She was obviously much loved by the family. She lived in the laundry cottage, that's the back of the laundry cottage, being visited by Mary on one of Mary's visits here. And I don't know her background or whether she was in charge of the laundry in its heyday. But she appears in many pictures and labelled all carefully as Kate Murphy. One of the things that I wish people who were still around I could ask me, can you tell me more about Kate Murphy? Evelyn's influence continued in Abbeyleix after her widowhood. Ivor DeVesci, her nephew, inherited because Mary couldn't. And I'm quite sure in my mind that it was Evelyn, with her great love of the arts and her patronising artists, really celebrated artists at the time. The whole Abbeyleix house was almost on top to toe in William Morris fabrics of that period. And I'm sure it was Evelyn's influence that galvanised her nephew Ivor to start the carpet factory in Abbeyleix. It had started in Durrow, but it was sputtering and would have sputtered out. And I'm sure it was Evelyn giving her nephew a good nudge, saying, you've got to take this over and move it into Abbeyleix, where it was a wonderful job opportunity for young ladies in Abbeyleix who had really very few outlets. Either you got married young or you went off to work in one of the grand houses. But this gave an option, and the carpet factory was right employment for the ladies. There were opportunities for the men for the sawmill and embroidery. So I think Evelyn's influence continued. And this was Ivor, her nephew. Ivor was the fourth lieutenant. He was the son of the fourth lieutenant's brother Eustace, who died very young in his early 30s. He was hale and hearty on Monday and went out shooting and caught a chain. And on Friday he was no more. That's what it would be like for antibiotics. So I don't hear him and he was benign and nice. He didn't have a fair imagination of either. So I don't think he would have started the carpet factory on his own back. This picture, you're probably familiar with this on the Valley Road. There's almost no pictures right there, which is odd. There's one tiny little miniature. And there's this figure and one or two other ones. Ivor married twice. The first marriage lasted an extraordinarily short time. I don't know what happened. But I think he married in April and it was over by October. Something of a record, I think. And I simply don't know what happened. There's pictures of his first wife and she looks absolutely drop dead beautiful. And she looks as though she's fine, she's laughing, but clearly something wasn't quite right. And she was called Georgina. But anyway, poor Georgina made an exit. And then 10 or 12 years later, he married the widowed Lady Ross, whose husband had died from First World War wounds. So she was called Lois, and there's definitely people around who would remember her. I know that Tom Kelly at Kilmark, for instance, remembers her. She was quite a formidable lady. She lived to be 101. I remember her, I remember calling her up. I wrote her, I met her in her old age with my parents. There was a bit of, my parents got on with everybody except Lois. And there was I think Aunt Lois kind of resented my parents. Aunt Lois had children after her first husband, and I think she made it clear she wasn't going to have any more. Thank you very much. But somehow she kind of resented, I think, the fact that her nephew, their marriage was going to get married. The relationship wasn't great anyway. I was younger brother, was Tom, and he went into the Irish Guards, great friend of General Alexander's, and he fought in the First World War. He's the one in the middle there. He was a very good boxer, the on trucks for boxing. 3 times he was wounded in the First World War, 3 times went back, but he survived in this. He married a lady from Killarney, from Sicily, who was my grandmother, which is why it was interesting to have that picture of Lord Ken there, who was Sicily's father. They married in 1911. So that's her wedding dress. And another nice wedding invitation too. With this picture of 28th of October, so the wedding anniversary. The Kenmares in Killarney were one of the few big landowning families that were Catholic and that stayed Catholic. So Sicily was brought up a Catholic, and that's why my father was brought up a Catholic, which is why I'm from that tradition. And that's my father. Age 19, he went to Cambridge University, and then his father told him the war was inevitable, so he better quit the university and join the army. Which he did, and then he was captured and spent most of the war in prison. And at the end of the war, he married Susan, and I'm sure a lot of people will remember her. That's my parents when they just announced their wedding engagement. Interestingly enough, my mother had a close tie to her as well. And my parents worked as agents for my father's uncle, who was Lord DeVesci at the time, in Millbrook, which, as most of you know, is now being developed as a hotel. It always intrigued me at the time there were 2 front doors. One, the near one, to the right of the picture, was for business, and the estate office were the 2 ground floor right-hand windows, and the other front door with the porch was for the family. I don't know when this picture was taken, and I have no idea who owns that Red Sports Company. It certainly wasn't anyone in the family. And that is Ivo, who died in 1958 in a car crash in Mullingar. He was an Abbeyleix, since he inherited in 1903, so he's here a long time. Sadly for him, he had no children. He was very passionate about forestry and very passionate about the sawmill, and very keen on employing as many people as he can. He felt he had a duty to the town to employ as many people as he can. It wasn't a great recipe for commercial success, but I think it kept the town alive at a time when there really was a lot going in rural Ireland. And around this time, Ivo took a lot of photographs. He was a very good photographer, although I wish he'd photographed slightly different things. He did take these photographs of Napton House, which is another thing about which we seem to know so little. It was demolished, sadly, and it's where I live. It was the gamekeeper's cottage. But I'd love to know more about this house. If anybody was told anything about this house by their grandparents, and I would love to know what the interior. Ivo took these wonderful pictures, and you might recall the Laois Library digitized a huge amount of it. The tremendous quality, it was very complete, but he tended to, I just wish he'd photograph what I would regard as more interesting things. And he photographed the exterior of Napton House from a distance. And the next photographs he took of Napton House were in the latter stages of demolition. And you'd think he'd have gone in and taken a few pictures of it before it disappeared, you know. So we had some fine pictures of the demolition, and that's it. Apparently the interior was exquisite. And there we are. It's not until a Sunday he gets his camera again, which is frustrating. I mentioned that my mother had a connection to Burr. That was my mother's mother, who was a tremendous beauty. She was called Anne Nestle from a family of financiers in England. It was an old Jewish family that had come to England and done well in finance and become anglicised. And Anne had two other brothers, but she was very smart. She seemed to manage to get all the family possessions herself and chisel her brothers out of her. But she had two marriages. Her first marriage was to Viscount Jones, where she had my mother Susan, and Tony, who became Lord Snowden, and then she married Lord Ross, who was much. She didn't think that Mr. Jones was really very glamorous, and she thought she could trade up a bit. So she divorced Viscount Jones and married Lord Ross, who was also very handsome and eligible bachelor, owning Burr Castle amongst other things. So she changed from Mrs. Armstrong Jones to Lady Ross, and appropriate jewellery to match her new status, which she very much enjoyed. And my mother, and this rather ugly little boy on her back, into his two sisters. And I'm sure there are people here who might remember my mother back in these days. That's when they were living in England. And there is my mother, I'm sure maybe we might remember her. Any stories that you could tell or pass on would be great, just to add to the story history we have for the place. And my father, I'm sure many of you will remember him too. And I'm sure many of you or some of the older people who perhaps not will remember occasions happening in Abbeyleix, like when my mother's brother married Princess Margaret. Was created quite a stir, and they came and visited here at Abbeyleix House in the background. I can vaguely remember being very excited by all the guards and the guns they had in their pockets and so forth, because it was not without its protesters as well at the time. I can remember being on the last train from the Abbeyleix station, and I'm sure perhaps other people can, and again it would be wonderful. I know Ronnie Gramley is a great expert in the trains, but I'm just afraid that we're going to lose so much history of Abbeyleix with the passing of the generations. This is interesting considering what's happening at the moment with the roof's gone. I can vaguely remember, and I'm sure other people can, when it was the DeVesci Arms. I don't know what happened to the sign above the door. I didn't ask if anybody still had it. It must have disappeared. But it would be nice if that was recorded and kill them up as it was before any of the changes in new houses. Sweet view. I really like it. See that once or twice? I think that's your house window, isn't it? And of course, I didn't even know there was gates outside those buildings until sometime about 10 years ago I came across it. And again, this is the main street when I was a small boy, which I'm sure many of you remember. Paddy Home was the butcher, which was a butcher's shop up until this year. And now it's going to be, I think, the inevitable telephone shop. And again, I'm sure many of you remember this scene. See my father's Land Rover there in the bottom right-hand corner. And almost no traffic. It was extraordinary. But you could, I remember as a small boy to look and see where my father was, where the car was. Extraordinary. I think we had 3 or 4 filling stations, petrol stations, even though they appeared to have any car. There's 2 of them for a start. And then we're Cambridge further on. Which you can see is how few cars there were. And I'd like to be able to identify some people in this picture. This is the sawmill that I remember, which is a small boy. Everybody seemed to wear the same area hat and come in with bicycles. I'd love that help in identifying who's who in these pictures. I'm sure there might be people who know. I've got quite a few pictures of the sawmill, and it's even then the machinery is somewhat antiquated. It carried on losing money for year after year, but it employed a lot of people, and I think that's the lasting legacy of how they kept the town going. But it'd be great to know who these people are, and their grandchildren are still be alive if years ago.
Sorry, are they digitised on the library site?
They might be. Yeah, I think they are. I think they are. If they're not, if somebody gives me a shout, I'll just think that if anybody feels they might be able to identify people.
Yeah.
And if there are any, there must be so many anecdotes of the sawmill about what went on. There must have been lots of pranks and hopefully not involving any sort of. There must have been also, there must have been tremendous richness of the characters who went there and what they did and what their little secrets were. I know that when I talk to people, you hear these wonderful stories. And again, my worry is that they're lost to us. And again, more pictures of the sawmills here. And some of you might remember Chris Delaney, who was butler in the house for 5 generations, which is, well, I was the 4th, I think. And when my son David appeared, he said, "This is the 5th generation," he said, and I think I've had enough, he said. But he lived at Bluegate, down opposite Kilmarnock as well, and he was an extraordinary story. I just wish that I had recorded more of his stories, because he worked with evening way back then, and we remember Lois. Over the rest, my father, and he put up with me, and then Daniel as well. And he was one of those extraordinary people who was so bright and so capable, and knew everything and could remember everything. And here are 2 characters that many of you will probably recognize. Will be Jimmy Philip and Tom Black and Joe Hobson. Again, they have told the stories of Peter Joe Hobson. And if there are anecdotes of them around, it's so important to get them done. And Pat O'Brien was, many of you, I don't think Kevin is with us this evening, but many of you will know Kevin who lives in Kilmarnock, who is one of the great historians. Pat was his father, and Pat worked for my grandfather in England and came back to Abbeyleix in the 50s. He grew up with my father. They were very close together. And Pat was another character, another person, very, very bright person with extraordinary knowledge and could mend and fix everything. And he almost ran the whole estate because he was the one person who knew how everything worked. And with Pat a lot of knowledge left as well. Although Pat's sons, Kevin, is in Kilmarnock, and Tony lives in Wexford. They did so quite a lot. And to this day, I ring up Tony and say, "Do you know where such and such a drain comes out?" And he'll be able to tell me. He knew all about the turbines that generated electricity in the estate, and the dynamos, and how this extraordinary system of waterworks in China, petrol stations, even though they appear hardly any cars. There's two of them for a start, and then the families further on. Which you can see has through cars as well. I'd like to be able to identify some of the people in this picture. This is the sawmill that I remember, which is a small boy. Everybody seemed to wear the same area hat and come in bicycles. I'd love to help in identifying who's who in these pictures. I'm sure there might be people who know. I've got quite a few pictures of the sawmill, and it's even then the machinery is somewhat integrated. It carried on using money for year after year, but it employed a lot of people, and I think that's the lasting legacy of how they kept the town going. But it'd be great to know who these people are, and their grandchildren are still be alive if it uses their life.
Sorry, are they digitized on the library site?
They might be. Yeah, I think they are. I think they are. If they're not, if somebody gives me a shout, I just think that if anybody feels they might be able to identify people. And if there are any, there must be so many anecdotes of the sawmill about what went on. There must have been lots of pranks and hopefully not involving dinosaurs. There must have been tremendous richness of the characters who worked there, and what they did, and what their little secrets were. I know that when I talk to people, you hear these wonderful stories. And again, my worry is that they're lost to us. And again, more pictures of the sawmills here. And some of you might remember Chris Delaney, who was butler in the house for 5 generations, which is, well, I was the 4th, I think. And when my son David appeared, he said, "This is the 5th generation," he said, and I think I've had enough, he said. But he lived at Bluegate, down opposite Kilmarnock as well, and he was an extraordinary story. I just wish that I had recorded more of his stories, because he worked with Evening way back then, and we remember Lois, my father, and he put up with me, and then as well. And he was one of those extraordinary people who was so bright and so capable, and who knew everything and could remember everything. And here are two characters that many of you will probably recognize. Would be Jimmy Taylor from Black and Joe Hobson. Again, they have similar stories, particularly Joe Hobson. And if there are anecdotes of them around, it's so important that they get them done. And Pat O'Brien was, many of you, I don't think Kevin is with us this evening, but many of you will know Kevin, who lives in Kilmarnock, who is one of the great historians. Pat was his father, and Pat worked for my grandfather in England and came back to Abbeyleix in the 50s. He grew up with my father. They were very close together. And Pat was another character, another person, very, very bright person with extraordinary knowledge and could mend and fix everything. And he almost ran the whole estate because he was the one person who knew how everything worked. And with Pat, a lot of knowledge left as well. Although Pat's sons, Kevin, is in Kilmarnock, and Tony, who lives in Wexford, they did sort of quite a lot. And to this day, they ring up Tony and say, "Do you know where such and such a drain comes out?" And he'll be able to tell them. He knew all about the turbines that generated electricity in the estate. And the dynamos power this extraordinary system of waterworks and channels and getting water pressure, sufficient water pressure to turn a wheel to generate electricity, and where the escape channels were underground. One of them curiously happened underneath the graveyard in the old church. And Tony swears to me that there was some obstruction or something, and his father told him to climb down this, crawl along this grave underneath the churchyard. Tony was a small boy, so maybe his imagination came into play, but he told me that he was looking up and seeing skeletons above him. So there's fun with all of those. We lost earlier this year. We had fun discoveries who worked in the woods. And their ideas. And that's the next generation, which is my children, that some of you will see or would have seen around. I'm just keen that to try and tell them as much as possible, so that when I'm gone, at least they have whatever knowledge I have. And my concern is that I just don't write down enough. And that's the problem. I think I probably actually galloped through probably too quickly, so I was scared of running out of time. But I don't know if there are anybody who wants to ask any questions about that period, or Ivo, or Evelyn. I'm afraid I haven't given a history lesson as such, but more as I said, gallop through a scaffold.
Sorry, I believe that carpets of the Titanic were made here.
The carpets of the Titanic?
Yes.
Yes, they were made in the carpet factory. Abbeyleix DeVesci, he took one rather enthusiastically the role of salesman, together with the poor, ill-fated Mr. Gillespie, who you probably see Mr. Gillespie's little memorial on the side of the tomb in the old church. But Ivo was really keen on promoting the carpets, and I think he sailed to America himself, and he cornered one or two people. I think on the journey they had 5 days where they couldn't escape from him, and I think he actually managed to sell quite a few carpets on the journey. Not the Titanic, obviously. But it was the days when those grand houses had big house parties and people would come on the train and they'd stay a week, and inevitably they would be marched down to the carpet factory, and an order book would be kind of shoved in front of them. And they would feel very much obliged to go to the carpets. And I think there are Abbeyleix carpets in some of the grandest houses in England. And they never really wore out. The weak point of the Abbeyleix carpets actually was the backing, because the stitches were tough stitches, and it was actually the backing of them that gave away. The wall was still good half-inch tufted wood sticking up the top. Mind you, the carpets for Abbeyleix house were almost entirely Abbeyleix, the entire house. It had sort of custom-made carpets, including the big hall. When Sir David built the house, he didn't want them, because he didn't feel that they were authentic. Not the Georgian look. The Georgian look was a more sparse, empty hall. My family, particularly Aunt Evelyn with her arts and crafts, she embraced that sort of cluttered look. The house was full of pictures, and there were hardly any space where you could see the wall, even though the wall had this magnificent William Morris arts and crafts wallpaper. So similarly, the carpets they covered the whole hall and all the important rooms. Probably what didn't help the backing for the carpet was the somewhat unique system that my family appears to have had for cleaning the carpets, which was to tie them to the back of a tractor and drive them at top speed around the fields in the summer, which had the effect of dusting. The carpets were hugely heavy. So it would be almost impossible to carry them. So what this did, it's not perhaps that surprising that here the backing was too weak. The backing probably wasn't designed for a top speed trip around the fields in the summer.
Do you know the story about your parents in Spike Milligan?
No. I remember being taken to the theatre by my parents.
When apparently your father and mother, accompanied by Grania and head language, went to the theatre in Dublin one night. And Spike Milligan, who had known your father in the army, spotted him in the audience. And throughout his performance, he made all these sort of in-jokes that only your father and Heck would have got. And apparently it was a very amusing evening for your parents.
Well, I was there.
You were
I was there.
there?
There was an empty seat next to me, and he got off the stage, and he walked and he sat next to me, and I was a small little boy, and he turned to me and he said, "Are you enjoying the show?"
Yeah.
And then he got back on the stage and carried on.
Growing
I was
up,
mortified. I was like 5, and the last thing I wanted to play was the worst nightmare. It's just something. Yeah, there were all sorts of interesting characters who came along. My mother's brother did a few. He just said this came down and chopped down a tree which fell in the wrong direction. He just left. And he totally smashed a fence and a car and a few other things. And there were pretty big things.
Such a brilliant network, everybody. The greatest source of crime is Mary Kelly. She lives in the laundry. She knows everything.
She lives in the... Which one?
Just beside work, she's my neighbour. And she knows so many stories. That family worked in a big house, and one of them got to burn, and she's got those stories.
Well, we have this. Thank you.
Mary Kelly's one.
So
And Tony Carroll, the electrician, is father of the one who works at Abbeyleix now. They know all about. They did all the basic work in houses.
Right. I didn't know they had an electrician to do
Tony Carroll, everything.
Yeah, they have a big Sorry.
We didn't have any shots of your mother's on marijuana reading, which was
I have, but I didn't produce them. But she is very revered in that world. I think Clifton Show is on this weekend. But even I go to the one in Manikara, and their bloodlines are very much prized to this day. And people would come up to me and say, "Oh, I remember your mother and her bloodlines," and say, "Oh, this pony here is a grandchild, great-grandchild of the Abbeyleix ones." That was extraordinary achievement. She had very few ponies, but she had a very good knowledge of ponies, and for other things as well. And even going back to generations, the artist that Even DeVesci, she was a lady, remember, who was widowed and would come back, and the one who nudged her nephew to start the cupcake factory. I mean, amongst the artists that she patronized were Alfred Gilbert, who, that tomb that I mentioned that was outside and ended up being brought into the early church, was by Alfred Gilbert, who was a really renowned sculptor at the time. And he was the sculptor who made the statue in the center of Piccadilly Circus, the very famous one of Heroes shooting an arrow up Shaftesbury Avenue, which was the shaft of the arrow in Shaftesbury Avenue. So he was Sir Alfred Gilbert, made Sir Alfred Gilbert. So she patronized him, George Frederick Watts, who was actually the artist of one of the pictures of that shows you there. And William Morris, and all the amount of William Morris fabric, which is now very fashionable again, and wallpaper. The drawing room Abbeyleix was this magnificent deep blue wallpaper. It was original William Morris, commissioned by Evelyn, which was a really bold move because it was a very classical room with the classical adamant ceiling, symmetry, simplicity, beautiful Palladian proportions, etc. To go and wallpaper with William Morris was very, very good. It was an incredibly well-invited room. And sadly, that disappeared, was taken down after we were divorced. But she was very cognizant of who were the really great artists of her time. And then when she moved to England, and her daughter married and lived in Somerset. The daughter would have taken a lot of things were quite understandably, it was her home. And some of them are still in Somerset. So her daughter's grandson is my cousin Bernard, who's an exceptionally nice person. I get very well with him. Occasionally I go there. There's all these treasures that were from Abbeyleix in his house. So, but he comes here every now and again too. So I was trying. I always feel slightly embarrassed walking around his house photographing things in house his wall. But the amount of extraordinary artists that have come into Abbeyleix at the time. Nutchins up the road was commissioning the Hayward Gardens. And my great-grandmother, even sister-in-law, was commissioning at the same time a really large, important garden by Nutchins. Coincidentally in Somerset too, called Hestercombe, that's very similar to a much larger version of Ballinkill. And I always feel that Hutchins must have come to Abbeyleix house because he wrote in his diaries how much he disliked Colonel Coe, who was his client at Ballinkill. And you can walk from Ballinkill to Abbeyleix house cross country, and I walked to Ballinkill in an hour and 40 minutes cross country. So it's hard to think that he wouldn't have walked to Abbeyleix where the son of his important client was, particularly if he detested his client as Ballinkill. So Nutchins must have come as well. Going through the visitors book at Abbeyleix house, you can see this list of really interesting names, people like Professor Mahaffey, who was Oscar Wilde's tutor at Trinity College. Gladstone's name is in the visitors book when he visited. So when, as I said, he used to use Ivo DeVesci as a sort of sounding board of how would such a plan go down amongst the landowners of Ireland. I rather think the answer is probably normally not very well.
Did Lloyd George come?
Not that I know.
I have visited people from the grounds to the Manor, and Lloyd George appears quite a number.
Did he? Was he here?
He came from the shooting.
Did he? Probably. Yes, he probably did. On that occasion, but just neighbours like that, thing to hang out with each other with. So
And Daisy Bingle was the regular visitor.
Who?
Daisy Bingle.
That was her work, yeah, that was her work where I read that
I
extract.
lent it to the man who owns grants to the Manor, but when I get back to my farm.
Well, I had it, and that was, it was just a joy to come through, to pick up, literally just pick up bookstore, waiting
I mean, the visitors book.
But this is book, not just what you read.
You don't mention Paddy Mulhall at all. He would have been a great source of information for you here.
And he was, yeah, he did everything. one
He was a
through.
fantastic wrecking.
He certainly had that skill for sure. No, I mean, he passed on lots of interesting information.
Where did DeVesci come from?
Well, it's a Norman name, and they came over with the conqueror, and they were quite big, important, they were very big important bands in the Roman days, in the conqueror, and they were huge chunks of land, they lived in particularly Northumberland. They built Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, which was a very important castle, and it's now the home of the Dukes of Northumberland, and we've been there a very long time. But there is in the wall the DeVesci coat of arms, and I've got a cousin who goes, I vaguely know the Duke of Northumberland. My cousin is in there, goes and stays there, when the Duke is talking about all of his family, and my cousin annoys him by saying, oh, but yes, but there's an even older DeVesci coat that's still in the wall. So Eustace, there's great stories about Eustace DeVesci, including there's one old book in the library, I think I still have it, that recounts the story about how true it is or not, it's all in ancient Old English. That Eustace DeVesci apparently had a very pretty wife, and King John wasn't always all that nice and kind, but he rather fancied Eustace's wife. So this is all written out in his book. So Eustace was having dinner with the king, and King John turned to Eustace and said, oh, Eustace, that's a very nice ring you have there. I've got a similar stone and I'd like to get it set in the same way, make a ring of it. Could you please lend me the ring? And the ring had Eustace's seal on it, because in those days it's a sign means you can seal. So Eustace handed over the ring, and the next day King John said, oh, Eustace, by the way, there's a rather awkward rebellion going on in Wales. Would you mind going and sorting it out? So Eustace went out to sort out the rebellion in Wales. Picture his surprise when he sees a carriage coming towards him on the same road with his wife in it. So he asked what she was doing, and she said, "It's a message from him saying, come at once. It's sealed with a ring." Apparently, this is I'm not making this up, it's all in the book. Eustace got, to quote from the book, Anne Common Hall, and put her in, dressed her up in the wife's clothes and put her in the carriage and sent her off to the king. Some time later, he sorted out Wales, Eustace came back, and the king was bragging and said, Eustace, you've got a wonderful wife. And Eustace says, yes, I have. And then King John went on and said, I should know. And at that point Eustace said, no, what you know about is Anne Common Hall. Where probably wasn't a good move in Eustace because he fell out over rather quickly after that. And they tumbled down from favour. I didn't know it because of that story. I didn't know whether that story is true, but it is written in this old book. So they crossed their lines and they slid down the stair and bubbled up again. But by that time, as was often the case, the dirt had dropped out and the Vesci had changed the spelling of it. It was V-E-S-E-Y. And when they improved their status a bit and they were made peers, lords, they were asked what title they would like. So they were going to be promoted from Lord Napton up to the extra rank, to Viscount. And they said, oh, we'd like the old Norman spelling of our family name, please. We'd like to be DeVesci. So that's how DeVesci came back. So it's really confusing because the family surname is Vesey. And my Irish passport was just Thomas Vesey, V-E-S-E-Y. But I have a British one which I never use. and that says DeVesci. So they're confusing. They're so similar. They're confusing. And in most families, we think they're the family name is Parsons, and the title is Ross, and it's completely different. But in my family, it's so similar, just carries everything at once.
Just chap here, Tom.
Yeah, just a short question. I'm a tour guide in Port.
Oh, yeah.
I was just, yes, thank you. I was just wondering, do you have any, as far as visitors, any recollection as a young boy, stories that you have heard from your father about the 6th Earl of Port Harrington? He would have left in 1920.
Wasn't he? He was in Australia.
His wife was one of the
Yes, Australia. There was, she must have been a dowager called Winnie.
Yeah.
And I met her, she happened to be a good friend of Cicely, whose wedding invitation she had. And when I was a small boy, I would have to spend half term. We get Saturday, 11 o'clock Saturday, out in the half term, and you have to be back in by 6 o'clock Sunday. So there's no way on my travel, so I'd be farmed off just on the corner. Quite often it was Cicely, and her great friend was Winnie, Lady Port Harrington. And we go to that. I remember she was tiny. She was slim and tall and very kind as a small boy. And I can remember being a small boy, kind of shy about kissing grown-ups, and you just well not, but you kind of have to. And I can remember making this, what I thought would pass as a kiss, goodbye, thank you for lunch to Lady Port Harrington. She looked down at me and she said, "Lips, please." And do it again, you look more feeling. I never forgot. Port Harrington said, "Lips, please." But she lived somewhere near Icicle or somewhere. My grandmother was somewhere near. My grandmother did Sunnydale, so she was somewhere around there. But there are much earlier diaries from Lady Caroline.
That's right.
Talking about coming to stay at Abbeyleix house, and you probably read them.
Yeah, and would really find out as a gift.
Oh, did they? I didn't know that. Yeah. But I thought it was interesting, that's going back to this late 1700s, and saying how informal the DeVescis were, and how nice it was, because you could do what you like, and there were small groups of people chatting away, and it wasn't regimented, and old DeVesci was very genial, and you just let people do what they want. That was quite strange at the time, when everybody tended to have more regimented. This is what we do now, and then we stop at that time, and we do the next thing.
Do you have an archive of papers?
Well, yes, they're up in the National Library. There's some more in Somerset, and because of Bernard, Mary uses the single photo of people. She took quite a lot of contemporary papers with her. That would have been her mother's letters, certainly some of it. And Bernard told me that unfortunately, when Mary was in her old age, she opened this chest of papers that would have been fascinating, because it would have been letters to artists and politicians, and really an interesting friend she had. And she threw a lot of them in the fire. She sat in a chair next to the fire with this chest, and she put out a quarter of a letter. And whether she kept it or not had nothing to do with how interesting or important it was. It was entirely on whether she liked personally. So there could be some really, really important letter she put, appalling person. And somewhere they're staying in the fire, he was gone. Couldn't stand him. So one gets to think, what was lost. But what was left, Bernard put in the Somerset County Council archives. So there is some stuff there. But the vast bulk of it, particularly the earlier stuff, is all in the National Libraries, where it's available for researchers.
Chap here.
So, you know the way Abbeyleix used, like, it was a couple of kilometers that way. There was a town before called there was a town before Abbeyleix called Old Town, yes. And it was moved because it kept flooding. Did that have DeVesci influence? at that time?
Oh, very much so, yeah.
So DeVesci has
Yeah,
always been here. Like.
Obviously, there was an Abbeyleix, and we don't know exactly, we can't pinpoint exactly where the buildings were, but we have a very good idea that where the old church and the estate is and where the kitchen gardens are. Almost inevitably must have been the site of the Abbey because it's very near the Monk's Bridge, and it's near the river, and it's almost the only bit of ground close to the river and close to the bridge that doesn't flood. So you can say with some certainty it was there. Also, Joe Hudson, one of the pictures I showed you, as a gardener, he recalls digging up skeletons, which, interestingly enough, Joe came up to right here in the knee. He used to come up and say, "We dug up skeletons," he said, and they were all giants. So where they were, if they were unusual, because in those days people were not modular at all. So the original town of Abbeyleix would have grown up almost certainly at the entrance to the Abbey, because with the Abbey there would have been trade, there would have been people buying and selling things. The monks themselves would have produced quite a lot of goods themselves, and for other people they probably produced beer, they would have grain, various other agricultural things, and possibly some timber as well. So almost inevitably on the sort of gates of the Abbey there would have been a settlement of people, and the monks would have employed non-monastic people as well for jobs. So the original town of Abbeyleix would have sort of grown up with the people who were there, and the land was not ideally suited, it probably was marshy, but also I think a major factor would be those houses probably would not have been built of stone. They would have probably been built of a mixture of less durable materials. So I think it wasn't only the flooding. I think it wouldn't have had proper drains, it wouldn't have had, certainly wouldn't have had sewage. So I think it was just flooding would have been one factor, but just the desire to build proper, well thought out planned town.
So
was instrumental in the move.
Would the DeVescis or their ancestors have been here since like plantations, really? Or
They weren't planted, they were clergymen who came over. They were Protestant clergymen. Apparently the forebear of the one who made the first jump from England to Ireland, he said to have killed somebody in a duel and had to make himself scarce in England. And his son was up as a clergyman in Northern Ireland in the early 1500s. So they weren't planted, but they were Protestant clergymen. And there was, if you managed to get yourself promoted, you could make a few bob the bishop if you like. So that's what they did.
And sorry, last thing. Did you say your father fought in the Second World War?
He fought the Second World War.
Where did he fight?
Well, he was in the Irish Guards, which was almost entirely Irish men, or the officers and the men were all very close ties with us, including General Alexander, who was from Caledon, up in the north of Ireland, who was his best mate. They joined up together. Sorry, I guess the previous generation. I just got the generations wrong. Alexander was in the grandfather generation. So my father left Cambridge when the war started, and the Irish Guards were the first regiment to do anything in the war. The war was declared in midsummer, and almost nothing happened in 1939 until September, when Germany invaded Norway, and the Irish Guards were chosen to go to Norway to fight the Germans, and they were put into ships and sent off to Norway. In September, the days are still very long, and the daylight hours were very long, and the Luftwaffe spotted the convoy and had, 18 hours of daylight in which to bomb the convoy, which they did. My father was there. So I think it wasn't only the flooding. I think it wouldn't have had proper drains, it wouldn't have had, certainly wouldn't have had sewage. So I think it was just flooding would have been one factor, but just the desire to build proper, well thought out planned town.
So
was instrumental in the move.
would the DeVescis or their ancestors have been here since like plantations, really? Or
They weren't planted, they were clergymen who came over. They were Protestant clergymen. Apparently the forebear of the one who made the first jump from England to Ireland, he said to have killed somebody, a Jew, and had to make himself scarce in England. And his son was up as a clergyman in Northern Ireland in the early 1500s. So they weren't planted, but they were Protestant clergymen. And there was, if you managed to get yourself promoted, you could get a few bob become a bishop if you like. So that's what they did.
And sorry, last thing. Did you say your father fought in the Second World War?
He fought the Second World War.
Where did he fight?
Well, he was in the Irish Guards, which was almost entirely Irish men, or the officers and the men were all very close ties with us, including General Alexander, who was from Caledon, up in the north of Ireland, who was his best mate. They joined up together. Sorry, I guess the previous generation. I just got the generations wrong. Alexander was in the grandfather's generation. So my father left Cambridge when the war started, and the Irish Guards were the first regiment to do anything in the war. The war was declared in midsummer, and almost nothing happened in 1939 until September, when Germany invaded Norway, and the Irish Guards were chosen to go to Norway to fight the Germans. And they were put into ships and sent off to Norway. In September, the days are still very long, and the daylight hours are very long. And the Luftwaffe spotted the convoy and had, 18 hours of daylight in which to bomb the convoy, which they did. My father was the most junior officer. He was only 19 at the time. And there weren't enough comfortable officers' cabins, because it wasn't a military ship, it was a ship that had been taken over by the military and adapted. All the senior officers got comfortable cabins which happened to be in the centre of the ship, near the funnel and engine. And the bomb came down the funnel, straight the funnel, and exploded in the engine. And the ship was sinking fast, and that one killed all the senior officers. So my father, aged 19, was suddenly the most senior person. My father, one of the few things my father told me was that a very experienced sergeant major came up to my father saying, "What would you like me to do? Should I get all the men on board, where there would probably be machine guns by the aircraft? But if the ship goes down in a hurry, there's some chance of swimming. Or should I get them down on the deck, protected from machine guns, if the ship goes down and they go around the deck?" So, tough call. And there was one very, very brave Norwegian merchant shipman who sailed his boat alongside the boat, and the men in the Irish Guards were almost a man, they were Irish. They were so disciplined that they stood in line even though the ship might go down in a second. And the discipline was incredible, but because they had such discipline, they were able to get all the men off that boat and onto the Norwegian merchant ship before the ship sank. And the captain of the Norwegian boat said he couldn't believe it, that they just stood. Nobody got out of line. And he said if they had been any jostling or barging, they would have got to be broken.
And so were they captured then? Or?
No, my father was definitely from Mario, and he recuperated, and then he joined the fighting again in Africa. They then invaded Sicily, the Allies invaded Sicily, came up to the south of Italy.
That was in 40.
And then they had a scheme to bypass the German lines by landing at Anzio, which they did successfully. Anzio is just south of Rome, and the commander of the Irish Guards made a huge mistake was when they landed successfully behind the Germans, instead of pressing on, he stopped to recuperate. And during the night, the Germans moved incredibly fast and surrounded the beachhead. And the Irish gunners took a terrible toll. Many of them were killed and many of them were captured. And my father was amongst the captured ones. So he was in the prison walking across the road. He was 7 stone 2 pounds when he came out. So, like nearly everybody knows, they're very reluctant to talk about it. But,
So how many years was that then he was in a prisoner of war camp?
43 till over 2 years. There was one at my boarding school when I was 8, 9, 10. There was a maths teacher. There was a very benign character. Everybody liked him. They were always grateful. But I seemed to be cut a bit more slack from most people, and I seemed to get away with a lot. He was a mechanic. And he once mentioned to me, I knew I never thought more about it. And then my father had a diary that he wrote up after the war. I had seen his diary, but Mr. McCallum had been in the prison camp with him. And that explains why I got away with it. It was Musburg in Germany. Originally it was in Italy. And the Italians and Germans had the endearing habit of putting the prisoners into railway carriages at night and leaving them on the railway sidings. Because the Allies were bombing the railways. So they locked them in railway carriages at night, which was not apparently a
Was Lord Parscourt in the POW camp with him?
I didn't see him in the diary.
Did he talk about the dives of turnips?
I didn't hear that.
No.
I didn't hear that. But he might
I
have.
think
He might have
the
been.
dives in Italy was much better than in Germany.
Was it? Still is. Still
The
is.
Italians were much more private when it came to drive.
Well, my father did actually find out a few things he said to me was actually that there was a crueler street in the prison towers in Italy than there was in Germany. So the Germans weren't exactly charming either. But he said there was some real sadies to Italy.
Maybe he didn't pay enough.
Almost certainly didn't consider it. Yeah, so the diary is interesting. Father was he was very good cartoonist, he was very good at drawing. And they used to improvise theatrical shows in the prison camp as best they could. And my father had the job of producing makeshift little posters advertising the production of whatever was on the next thing. Mission, and it was half a cigarette. They had sort of army reunions or things. And it was people who'd gone through that tended to very much compartmentalize that part of their life. And they would talk about it. People who had the same common experience really didn't like talking about it, even amongst their family. I wish I'd come to you for more information. And that's really the scheme is ironic. See, just all these things is a sugar mix. Grandmother like Kinani, for instance. I mean, nothing like it. She grew up in it, but it must be like too much information lost. So I think that's not important enough. Be very patient.
Can you tell us a little bit about your mother? I can vaguely remember her. She was very involved with Abbeyleix.
She was. She absolutely adored Abbeyleix. She adored Ireland. She wasn't good up in Ireland. Her mother became Lady Ross, and she spent quite a time as well when she was a child. But her relationship to Abbeyleix was intense. I mean, she absolutely liked it, in the same way that Evelyn did. I had a younger sister who died in infancy, and in the early 60s. She was only 2 years old when she died. And I think that inevitably that affected my mother a lot. And I think she absolutely plunged emotionally into Abbeyleix and what she could do for the community. She became very involved with handicapped children. She was very, very involved with Mrs. Tyrrell and various other people here, Peter Scully, in starting the St. Francis School for years, which is still going. And I remember she would be out most evenings involved in something to do with St. Francis School. And in those days, there was a stigma about having children that had handicaps. And very often people were reluctant to admit that their child had an issue. And many children missed out on opportunities that could help them a lot in terms of education suitable for their needs. And I remember my mother being almost in tears in meetings, and she'd go to places like Camrose, and she'd come back and she'd say, I know there's another child in this family, and I've been there 4 times, and I keep telling me there's 4 children, but I know there's a 5th. And I'm going to keep going back there until I can help that 5th child. And this was quite common. The 5th child that had issues was just locked in a room, and my mother was there. And nothing exist. And then she was always delayed. Eventually she convinced the parents that they could help the child. It took a long time. But she invested a huge amount. She absolutely loved Abbeyleix. She was very, very involved in her ponies as well. She loved that aspect of it. She wasn't really that interested in sort of smart social life at all. She could, she could, when she had to, she could do it. But she was really happy when she was being playing music, doing something there. I remember as a small girl, when there was much less of a safety net for people with difficulty, people who lost their husband. And it was still, really wasn't a lot of work in the state in the early 60s. It wasn't patronising then, like we see now, people not very often hand a few provisions. Particularly at Christmas time, I remember going around a long list, and she'd make all these parcels up for people. And the children's party, for all the children that worked in the estate, trash range was extraordinary. It was obviously before the days of computers and spreadsheets. And she'd have this book. Every child was very much involved in the estate. There was a lot of contributing and so on. Would be given present, it would be wrapped up, they would have the child's individual name on it, and they put it in a sack for Father Christmas, otherwise known as Mr. Pfeiffer the Forester, a suitable Polish accent. And he would have his sack for him. He would put out all the parcels out, and he would read out the child's name. And my mother had these long lists what each child in that household, siblings were getting, to make sure no sibling got the same present in the same household. And last year's, to make sure nobody got the same present they got last year. And then she'd wrap each one up, put the name on it. She was really, really devoted to Abbeyleix. Yeah, and the people still people often come up to me and say they remember the children.
I was one of those children.
Oh, really?
I well remember exactly as you say.
Did you get past it?
Absolutely. And we played London Bridge is Falling Down.
That's it, yes.
Campbells and Glenlans, or Oranges and
Well, that-
Lemons. And a whole lot of past the parcel, lots of party games, and then we'd all have to sit down in the big hall and stay really quiet, and the bells would ring outside as Santa arrived with the reindeer's bell were ringing. Yeah, I remember as well. Yeah.
There was a big feed in it. There was a big feed in the room.
I was just going to say, we go downstairs then to the kitchen. We were all marched in twos, and the maids would have fancy white aprons with frills on the side. It was lovely.
I know, I like that. I always create leftover cakes.
And Edward Julie would bring us home then in the van, green
That's
van.
right.
We'd all have balloons and the big boys.
And the balloons would burst,
bursting
the
them on
tears
the
would be,
ones. Yeah.
I can remember the balloons would be bursting before we got into the van. There'd be wailing and tears and balloons burst and another balloon would have to be fired in front. Yeah, I think people now do realise. There was a big room that was the dining room of the East, and we were not allowed in that room from the 1st of December. So the whole thing had all these little gifts on the floor, and all the little neighbours. No, my brother's getting a hat, I have to give her something else, and all that. It was extraordinary. She was delighted to.
And then at one stage then it changed over to being in Abbeyleix every second year, and then forward
Right,
the year
yes.
between. Yeah. We used to go on the bus with bags further.
That's right, I remember that.
On one occasion, I remember, I was one of the biggest at the time, and the bus went over something on the road, and a hole appeared.
That's right.
In the bus.
Something broke in the bottom of the bus,
Oh.
and a hole appeared
No.
in the aisle. I had to hold the children near it, and to sit in on the seat and hold this water on its back.
So we just said, oh, we And how was it? Did you enjoy going to Bern, or would you prefer to stay here?
It was lovely either way, because we had fun over there as well.
Yeah.
I probably preferred it here, really, but I enjoyed it
That was
over
the
there
right
as well.
answer. But still, I enjoyed it. I mean, Bern was pretty, go to classes, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was an adventure going and coming back, and yeah.
Probably could have done that at our university. Yeah, Mr. Pfeiffer was one of the Christmas when you had a very pronounced Polish accent. Another wonderful voice, yeah. Oh, the Christmas sounds just like Mr. Pfeiffer. My mother said, yes, because it's very, very much
How are you still? So is the Ross family still in Burcastle? Are they
Yes,
still there?
very much so, yeah.
And how are you related then, or is it through marriage?
Well, Lady Ross,
Yes.
who was the beauty wearing the jewels, that was my mother. That was my mother's mother.
Yes.
So my mother was from the first brood, if you like,
Yes.
and her second marriage, she had two sons, one of whom is the present Lord Ross, who is in his late 80s now. So he is my uncle, half uncle.
Yes.
So and I would see him a lot. Quite involved, so that we would always go back as influence. But it's not easy to keep the show on the road, right? Because you can imagine the upkeep for the castle. It's just huge. They have a little flat, if you like, on the side of the house, because they are still ready for 80s now. So they have a more comfortable, more smart place where they can sleep.
Yeah.
And they've also kind of opened up to the public as well.
Sorry?
They've opened up to the public a bit as well, haven't they, from their walks?
Yes, the gardens are open.
Yeah, I think there's also stuff that was going on during the summer maybe as well.
The gardens are open every day, I think, on Christmas Day or something like that.
Yeah.
And, tours of the castles you have to book them, I think it's 4 days or something like that. And you can book a tour of the castle. But you can't just walk out. But I mean, I think it's very accessible, you can imagine. There's a website that you just if you're having different
What age was your sister when she died? I remember that.
She was, I think, around 2.
Yeah, she was very young.
Very young.
In fact, we lived in Heath House.
Sorry?
We lived in Heath House.
Oh, right.
So we had one of those titanic carpets, or one of the carpets made in Abbeyleix house.
Right.
Yeah, we did at one stage. Yeah.
Sorry, were they 100% wool, the carpets?
Yes.
Yeah. It's amazing.
You still see them occasionally. I mean, they were tailor-made for Abbeyleix house, where I live now. Obviously, it's not as big as Abbeyleix house, but there's one carpet in one room that was made for Abbeyleix house. That's the nice bit.
That's amazing.
You come, I mean, anytime if I'm in a big house now, I'm pretty sure the ones in the library
What happened to the ones that were taking up the rest of them, apart from the ones that you have? Were they all sold? Or?
They were sold.
Yeah.
When did the carpet factory close?
It amalgamated in the, I think it's 19, somebody's probably going to know more than I do. I think around 1918, it amalgamated with the carpet factory. There is a very good book on the buildings actually. I'm sure they've got the good library. It's called Hidden in the Fire. And it's by Marie Johnson, who studied the carpet factory. And that one probably did it correct to reading that. It had its heyday, I think, just before the First World War. And then, obviously, the First World War was a tremendous hiatus for any sort of business like that. I know that I related to their carpet factory, which was a slightly similar enterprise. There was Lady Mayo Lace that started a similar factory road. And then I think they together were quickly absorbed into another bigger carpet factory.
You know the picture of Millbrook with the car in front? I think that might be Finnegan's.
It could easily be your Philippines. Certainly not flashy.
Yeah. He was kind of dapper, was he? Was kind of dapper, and I think he enjoyed it. Yeah. He is. He was a bookmaker.
He was a bookmaker.
Yeah. So but I think it was. I vaguely remember something about it. Sort of jazzy sort of style.
Yeah, and he was always very good, and he was always very nice and charming and kept me up beautifully. He was a very nice neighbour.
Joe Finnegan.
That's right, yeah. It was, yeah. Not sure it was from before Easter until I think early October. And she would work in the Catholic every day or so. And as kids we'd be enrolled. It was a busy day, of course. Sometimes unexpectedly lost me. She had unexpectedly so it was Mrs. Envy, used to work in the shop. It was, her son was so Did he? And he used to stay in a picnic with the flat here in Abbeyleix with his mother, nearly empty. That was the time when on the Eurovision with Brown. Because the entire summer, Mrs. MP would sing all kinds of rhythms. We love Mrs. MP, but we were fit to shoot Now my mother normally worked in the shop side of it and Mrs. MP in the cafe side of it. Yes, it was very different. There were some expensive tours that we took from America where I would stop speaking and be given sort of superior, they charge more, given superior fare. It would be the normal fare. And I can remember one moment where some visitors arrived in Boston. Mrs. MP, with a loud voice, said to my mother, in front of them, "Would I give them the best butter?" My mother said, "Of course, nothing but the best." And then she rumbled in the kitchen, said, "No, cheap butter."
And Mrs. Chiefin used to be there as well.
That's right, yes.
And Miss Ferguson. And Miss Contract.
That's right, that's right. Well, Miss Ferguson had been the governess originally to the Laois family that lived with that hill. And they had two daughters, and she was a private governess and lived at Black Hill. And then my sister, Kate, who was 2 years older than me, she used to cycle over there and get lessons. For some reason it took her an hour and a half to cycle. She lived on the assumption of not good to them. The Ferguson was very knowledgeable and very enthusiastic about wildflowers. So my sister figured out fairly early on that if she just produced any of those wildflowers, and said, "This is a very rare specimen. It's not like the normal one, Miss Ferguson. What do you think it is?" But Miss Ferguson instantly forgot. She took an hour and a half later. Specs will be on, the book will be out. She was from Derry. She's a very nice lady.
Oh, cheese.
Well, I'm sorry I didn't give you a proper history lesson.